Scientific Director of the Healthy Populations Institute. If you'd like to have a look at that, you can find our website at your nearest Google. And I would also like to point out that I am very proud to say that I'm a founding fellow of the MacEachen Institute. So I'm pleased to be here with you today. Thank you, all of you, for being here with us today. Before I get started with the introductions, I would just like to acknowledge that we are currently on unceded, unsurrendered Mi'kmaq territory, and that we are all treaty people. It's my sincere pleasure to welcome you all to this panel. This is part of the Policy Matters series that is brought to you by the MacEachen Institute. Again, we've got a great lineup of panelists today talking to you about their perspective on the issue of fake news and its impact on global political landscapes. We also have 5 students who will be asking questions, but initially we're going to start off with the short 10-minute or less comments from our panel. And again, our scholarly director, Kevin Quigley, can't be here today. He's actually in Nigeria at a conference, but he sends his regards to everybody in the audience and sends his sincere thanks to our policy panelists today. It's my pleasure to introduce you now to Kelly Toughill, who will be facilitating the panel part of today's discussion. Just for those of you who don't know, Professor Toughill is from the University of King's College School of Journalism. Kelly Toughill is a journalist, an associate professor, and an award-winning journalist and journalism educator whose writing focuses on 2 key topics. 1, journalism, economics, and immigration. Professor Toughill is a former reporter and editor of the Toronto Star. Please join me in welcoming Professor Toughill, who will introduce each of our panelists, and then she'll also facilitate the panel discussion as well. So again, please welcome Kelly Toughill.
Hello, everybody. Wow, this is a full house today. That is great. I am really honored to moderate a panel of such distinguished, talented journalists talking about a topic of such importance. I'm not going to talk long. I'm just going to set the stage just a little bit about fake news. So there's a Canadian journalist named Craig Silverman who is one of the people who helped popularize that term in 2014. And he originally used it to refer to sites that deliberately peddle misinformation for money. And writing in BuzzFeed last year, he said the term came to be used as kind of a partisan cudgel in 2016, and then eventually became completely meaningless by 2017 when the term was redefined to really just mean any news that you didn't like, even if it was objectively true. So now we're working with 3 different definitions to be used, really it seems, at anybody's leisure and pleasure in any way they want. I'm so excited we have the 4 of you to sort all of that out for us, because I'm going to have so much clarity at the end of this event. And obviously one of the deep concerns around this trend is that it actually diminishes the value of truth itself. And if we end up in a state in which facts themselves are no longer valued and we cannot actually discuss reality in any meaningful way, that's pretty perilous. So we usually discuss this trend in the context of the United States, or many of us do. But I just want to drop a note in here that this is, fake news is not a term used exclusively south of the border, that this is a topic that is timely everywhere, even in Canada. As many of you are aware, I'm sure Facebook is now taking steps to weed out false news. And there was a recent article saying that in Canada, Canadian referrals for bogus entries are up to 2,000 referrals flags a day in Canada. So our panel, these outstanding panelists have covered politics in Canada and the US. They are prominent practitioners of pretty much every kind of journalism we have now, I believe. Broadcast, magazine, and very innovative new digital platforms. So here's how it's going to work. Each panelist will speak for 10 minutes. I will introduce each panelist before they begin. We will then take questions from the audience. The first questions will come from some pre-selected students and then from the public, and I'll give you a little bit of etiquette on that before we start. If you ask a question of the panel, make it the question direct to a panelist, not the panel as a whole. So ask it of a specific person. The other thing, I just want to draw this in right now. We've all to events where you really, really, really want to hear what Elamin has to say. Somebody in the audience stands up and their question takes 5 minutes. I'm sure that you're all erudite and intelligent and fascinating. Please don't be that person. Please, when you ask your question, get to the point or I'll get that mommy face, right? And I will ask you to hurry it up and get to the point. So fair warning. I want the question session to be really good. So we're going to start with Keith Boag. Keith has been a journalist at CBC for years, mostly covering politics in Canada and the US. In 2012, he was posted to Washington, D.C. Good timing. From where he contributes to CBC radio and television and regularly writes political columns and features. And since 2015, he has devoted almost all his professional energy to covering Donald Trump and his rise to U.S. Commander-in-Chief. Keith.
Thank you very much. There's probably an infinite number of votes that I can make about why I'm here to talk about fake news. But since I got enough of that in my Twitter timeline, we'll just say thank you for inviting me. And I'm particularly honored to be here because it's the Alan MacEachen Institute. And Alan MacEachen was someone I had the great good fortune to get to know a little bit while I was starting my career as a political reporter in Ottawa. He was very kind with his time and helpful to me, and now this thing is not working. No, it's fine. And I remember him telling me once about, in a conversation, he said we should be case hardened against this thing. We should be case hardened. I didn't know what that meant, but I had since learned that it was a term for the hardening of steel, which of course Alan MacEachen would have to know a lot about, being the minister from Cape Breton. But if he were here today, he would be talking about fake news with us. He would tell us we should be case hardened against fake news, case hardened against the demagoguery it serves, and case hardened against the real threat it poses to the basic values of the Enlightenment: reason, science, progress, liberty, and tolerance. And because he'd witnessed most of the 20th century firsthand, he'd remind us that fake news in the service of an authoritarian can become propaganda for the institutionalization of wickedness. He would tell us it's not a trivial thing. Fake news has been around for much longer than what we know as modern journalism. That is, journalism that seeks to appeal to the broadest possible audience by being truthful, neutral, and detached. Journalism that aspires to an ideal of objectivity is only about 100 years old, whereas broadly speaking, fake news has been around since the beginning of time. Our interest in it at this moment is, of course, because of the twin earthquakes of 2016, Brexit, and the election of Donald Trump. And because I cover American politics, I'll deal with Donald Trump. As we all know, Trump has appropriated the term fake news and redefined it to mean anything that is negative about, critical of, or embarrassing to him. That could be a news story, it could be a public opinion poll, it could be an individual news reporter. By labeling any criticism as fake news and us as enemies of the people the way Trump does, he is aiming to both deny the truth about what is reported and undermine the public's trust in the sources of the unflattering information about himself. And that's what's dangerous. Imperfect as we are, the mainstream media are an essential part of a functioning democracy. And so an attack on us is an attack on democracy. At the same time, Trump is thoroughly unashamed that he is personally, legendarily, a prolific peddler of fake news himself. He built his career on the made-up story that Barack Obama was born in Kenya and was an illegitimate president. He promoted the idea that Senator Ted Cruz's father was a participant in some way with Lee Harvey Oswald in the assassination of John F. Kennedy. He has said that millions of people voted illegally in the 2016 election, and that's what cost him the popular vote. Most recently, as president, he's made up a story that all Democrats in Congress have pledged their support for an open borders bill that was drafted by Senator Dianne Feinstein. No such bill exists. And this is far from a new facet of Trump's personality. His signature building, Trump Tower, built in the 1980s in New York, is 58 stories high, but the elevator buttons are labeled to make it appear that it's 68 stories high. In his days as a developer, he sometimes masqueraded as fictitious people and pretended to reporters that he was the PR man for Donald Trump. And in that sense, he was acting as the fake source for fake news about himself. And the recent New York Times story that laid out his fraud and tax avoidance schemes that he and his father used when passing money from generation to generation, and exposed how Trump in his early days used his father's wealth to try to pretend to be a wealthier man than he really was, all of that suggests that he's lived most of his life as a fake. That a significant number of adults in America eagerly swallow Trump's prevarications was a serious thing before he became president. Since his election, it's become a serious subject about which there is serious scholarship and a couple of books that I'm going to refer to so that not everything I say here, which might sound strong, comes out of my own mouth. Books such as The Death of Truth by Michiko Kakutani and Network Propaganda by a trio of Harvard scholars were inspired by the threat Trump poses to the shared objective reality that makes democratic government possible. Both books accept that the rise of Trump and fake news is an epistemic crisis that was preconditioned by something in American culture, but they diverge on what that something was. Kakutani's The Death of Truth locates the origins of the current crisis in the second half of the 20th century and the political left's embrace of postmodernist ideas about cultural biases and relativism. She allows that postmodernism has many strands and many interpretations, but broadly speaking, postmodernism denies that there is an objective reality that exists independently from human perceptions. Postmodernism argues that knowledge is filtered through prisms of class, race, gender, and other variables, which leads Kakutani to say, postmodernists are hardly to blame for all the free-floating nihilism abroad in the land, but some dumbed-down corollaries of their thinking have seeped into popular culture and been hijacked by the president's defenders, who want to use its relativistic arguments to excuse his lies, and by right-wingers who want to question evolution or deny the reality of climate change or promote alternative facts. And here she quotes Mike Cernovich, the right-wing internet troll and fake news conspiracist who promoted Pizzagate. That's the theory that John Podesta and other Democrats were involved in a child sex ring. Here's what Cernovich told the New Yorker magazine in 2016. Look, I read postmodernist theory in college. If everything is a narrative, then we need alternatives to the dominant narrative. By the way, Pizzagate hoax led a confused and gullible young man to shoot up a Washington, D.C. pizza parlor with his AR-15, and he's now doing 4 years in prison. Kakutani also reminds us of what was said about P.T. Barnum, the great showman and hoaxer of 19th century America. His great discovery was not how easy it was to deceive the public, but rather how much the public enjoyed being deceived. Barnum's circus hoaxes appeal to a desire for entertainment. Fake news in the current moment appeals to a desire for the confirmation of fears and prejudices. Fake news is ultimately the nurturing of a reality that is not fact-based, but that aggressively encourages people to believe only what they want to believe, to ignore evidence that's inconvenient, to rewrite history. Kakutani's book pulls together a lot of ideas in an interesting way, but it doesn't get to the heart of what has happened to right-wing media over the last 3 decades. Yochai Benkler, Robert Farris, and Harold Roberts do. Their book is Network Propaganda, Manipulation, Disinformation, and Radicalization in American Politics. And it came out in September, so it's very fresh and very interesting. Network propaganda dismisses arguments about whether technology and social media are driving fake news, or whether Russian bots are to blame. It looks at a lot of data about media production and consumption from the 2016 election campaign through the first 18 months of Trump's presidency. It plots it, it maps it, it analyzes it, and it arrives at a clear conclusion about what's going on. What they say their data shows is that the rise of fake news in America is an asymmetrical phenomenon, meaning that it's not equally balanced, meaning it's not even remotely balanced between the political left and the political right. Fake news, as we're discussing it today, developed when the right-wing media ecosystem began to separate from the rest of the media. That was around the time Rush Limbaugh became a nationally syndicated radio host in the late 1980s. Limbaugh has deliberately severed himself from the mainstream media. For example, in a typical diatribe about climate change, he said this: "We live in 2 universes. One universe is a lie. One universe is an entire lie. Everything run, dominated, and controlled by the left here and around the world is a lie. The other universe is where we are, and that's what really reigns supreme, and we deal with it. and seldom do these two universes overlap. That was certainly at least the world that he wanted. That deliberately destructive message aims to cripple what Limbaugh routinely refers to as the four corners of deceit: government, academia, science, and the media. About Limbaugh, the authors of Network Propaganda write that his vitriol seemed designed to disorient his audience and unmoor them from the core institutionalized mechanisms for defining truth in modernity. Of the several different kinds of fake news, propaganda, misinformation, disinformation, disorientation strikes me as the most pernicious and destructive because it seeks to undermine confidence in institutions, in science, and in the very idea of truth. While Limbaugh was paving the way for Fox News, Breitbart, The Daily Caller, and Gateway Pundit, moderate or center-right conservative media began to fade into the background for conservative consumers. Now, obviously, the idea that fake news is a product of right-wing media can be a delicate position for someone in my position. So let me again quote the book. Anyone who insists on claiming that we cannot draw conclusions about which side is biased and which side gravitates more closely to the truth must explain how the media sources most trusted by consistently conservative survey respondents, that is Fox News, Hannity, Rush Limbaugh, and Glenn Beck, are the equivalent of the sites that occupy the same positions among consistently liberal respondents: NPR, PBS, the BBC, and the New York Times. That seems to me an obvious point, and it's supported by what we see happening in US politics. Despite having both houses of Congress and the White House, Republicans have found governing difficult in part because they've been unable to reconcile the world as their base sees it with the world as it actually is. Early in 2017, the Republicans moved quickly to repeal and replace Obamacare, and thus fulfill their signature promise of the past three elections. But Trump's promise to the Republican base that he could easily deliver cheaper and better health care for everyone proved unrealistic. At the same time, a significant part of the Republican Congressional Party would accept no compromise on the repeal promise. And so despite having all the power there was to have in Washington, the White House, the Senate, the House of Representatives, the Republicans weren't able to actually do anything about their key campaign promise. That is what is happening before our eyes in America. The destruction of a shared national reality and the triumph of Fox News and Breitbart over conservative center-right media. It's making it impossible to find common ground for political debate. And without that, it's impossible for government to meet the challenges the country faces. Thank you.
Thank you. So our next panelist is Jennifer Ditchburn. Jennifer Ditchburn is the editor-in-chief of Policy Options, the digital magazine of the Institute for Research on Public Policy, who are kindly co-sponsoring this event today with the MacEachen Institute. Jennifer spent more than 2 decades covering national and parliamentary affairs for the Canadian Press and for CBC. She is co-editor of the 2016 book, The Harper Factor, Assessing a Prime Minister's Policy Legacy, and a major contributor to the 2016 book, Sharp Wits and Busy Pens, 150 Years of Canada's Parliamentary Press Gallery, published by Hill Times. Welcome, Jennifer.
I actually have slides, but I promise that they are just pictures, no charts. So thank you for the introduction, and thank you to the Institute for inviting me to partner on this great event. And I want to give a very brief shout out to a professor here, Kim Brooks, who is also a member of the board of the Institute for which I work at the IRPP. So I think Keith has given us a really great overview of the dimensions of fake news and zeroed in on what's happening in the United States. So I thought it would be useful to look domestically at the history of the relationship between the media and government, and also to look at a little bit at questions around the development of political communications and government news management in Canada. I like to think about things in systems, and I'm also a bit of a history geek, so I think that there's been a kind of continuum that we're dealing with when we look at fake news in Canada. You know, government policy and the internal strategies of the Prime Minister's office specifically have a real impact on the press and the dissemination of reliable information by the public service. So I hope that you know who this is. Canada's had a really strong tradition of political journalism. So this is Joseph Howe, who was premier before Confederation in Nova Scotia. He was a speaker. He was a member of Parliament in Ottawa. But he's also the owner of the Nova Scotian and its parliamentary correspondent in Nova Scotia. In the 1830s, Joseph Howe was involved in a very famous case in which he was accused of seditious libel for taking on the powerful and the corrupt in Nova Scotia. So, like many other politicians in Canada, he transitioned from journalism into politics and back and forth. How many people can name one father of Confederation that was a famous newspaper owner? George Brown, who was a famous newspaper owner of the Globe. But you might not realize that at least 5 of the fathers of Confederation were also newspapermen. And I say newspapermen because, well, you know why. I won't beleaguer this point, but this is another Prime Minister, Mackenzie Bowell. Mackenzie Bowell owned the Belleville Intelligencer in Ontario until the day that he died. So you can see how intermixed political journalism and politics were in Canada. And so something that I feel that we should be proud of is that, now this is Parliament Hill in 1866. I really like this picture. It was a bit of a mess back then. But so Confederation was in 1867, and the first sessions were that year. But in 1866, the province of Canada, which was Ontario and Quebec basically, held their last sitting in the new building. So a year before Confederation, and guess what? The press gallery was already in the building. So we actually predate Confederation. And I always thought that was really cool, that the actual blueprints, if you look at the blueprints of the Parliament buildings, have the press gallery right in them. So it says something to you about how we regarded the place of journalists in Canada at the time. So the place of the media has been defended more or less in all of these 151 years in Canada, and I'm speaking specifically about federal politics here. But what I want you to note is that between 1867 and basically the late 50s to 60s, there was a really, really cozy relationship between the media and politicians. In fact, where you sat in the press gallery was a function of whether you were supporting the Conservatives or the Liberals. And when the Canadian press came on the scene in 101 years ago, they sat in the middle. But really, it extended for a very long time, where you could tell which political party that each newspaper supported. You're going to understand why I'm telling you about all this history. Canadian journalism went through the same revolutions in the 1960s that American journalism went. So all of a sudden it wasn't cool anymore to be seen as too cozy with the government. This is the time of investigative journalism and social responsibility journalism. And the idea of really holding governments to account and rooting out corruption. This is Davy Fulton in the hot room on Parliament Hill. The hot room is where many journalists work. And along with that time, there was another huge change, which was broadcast journalism. So radio and television through the 1950s and 60s. If you fast forward to the 1980s and 90s, what was another huge change was 24/7 news. Now that really had an impact on the relationship between the media and how the government interacted with each other. And so all this, and this is what I really want to emphasize to you, is it's a part of a continuum, an evolution in the relationship between the media and politicians in Canada. And if you want to talk about policy and public administration, because I think some of you are probably in that area of study or you work in that area, understanding how to control communications and control what the media was going to publish became a real preoccupation for the government in the era of Prime Minister Trudeau Sr. In the late 60s, there was a major government report called To Know and Be Known, and a task force was set out to say, like, what could we do about controlling government communications? Because there was very little government communications, strategic communications, before the late 1960s. And it's also important to note that this was happening across Western democracies, especially the UK and the US and in Australia. So when I think really the rupture, a big rupture happened between the media and government, what happened in Canada and the UK and Australia was in the 2000s. I like this photo. A colleague from the press gallery, Katie Simpson, that you might see now on CBC, took this picture about 4 or 5 years ago. This is members of Prime Minister Stephen Harper's staff putting up barriers on the tundra in Nunavut to keep about 6 reporters away from the Prime Minister. But I really want, I'm pinpointing them, but this was happening in several countries where there was a rupture between the established norms or expectations that the media and government had for each other. So in Canada, the Conservatives came to power, and there was that sort of like, whoa, what's happening that you see with the reporters happening in Washington right now. All of a sudden, access was limited. You weren't told anymore that when cabinet meetings were happening, reporters were threatened with blacklisting if they asked an unplanned question at a photo op. And then other things which I think are quite critically important was also the blurring of lines between public service communications and politics. And so you couldn't anymore get sort of anodyne information from public servants about statistics or technical data about a bill or so on without it coming back to you in the form of a political message. In my view, structured as a more or less a political message. And in the meantime, and this is where, I'm almost finished. This is where fake news comes into it. There was an effort in that period, and again, I'm not just talking about Canada, but I'm focusing on that. There was an effort to demonize the media. The name fake news hadn't come out yet, but had all the hallmarks of using the media as a political wedge. So journalists were characterized as standing in the way of citizens understanding the real story about what the government was doing. Supporters were brought into news conferences, then they heckled journalists as they asked questions. And that trend, by the way, is continuing if you see what Doug Ford is doing in Ontario. So if we fast forward to the last decade, there's also another major shift that all works together if you take into account the history and the evolution and everything, and that's the technology and especially social media. So social media has meant that if you're a politician, you don't need to talk to a reporter. I mean, you can get that quote-unquote unfiltered message directly to your base or to prospective voters by just getting at them through Twitter or through YouTube or through Facebook or any number of measures. So that's sort of deep in the chasm. And Keith mentioned this, so I'll just mention it very briefly, but what's been lost, I think, is the recognition of the media as playing an important democratic role. Instead, journalists are viewed as the enemy, to be controlled and to be avoided and even ridiculed. And this is a very damaging thing in this country, if you believe in the media being part of liberal democracy. So in my view, the move towards weaponizing the word fake news was a natural part of the evolution that we were already seeing in Canada. This is Cheryl Gallant, who's a member of Parliament. She did a YouTube video which she was already using the word fake news to attack news coverage that she didn't like from different news outlets. This is my last slide. Yes. So, but I want to say as a last thing that the media are not blameless. The media sat on its butt for a long time, I think, until social media and the fake news phenomenon started to shake it out of its complacency. It did very little, the Canadian media did very little to address the staggering lack of diversity in its newsrooms and its content. It still chooses to chase the sensational, to rush over research, to allow lapses in rigor, to focus on process over policy. Yasha Monk, in his recent book called The People versus Democracy, talks about how we can no longer ignore the flaws in our major democratic institutions. If we want people to trust them, we have to fix them, and that includes the media. So I think Leanne's going to talk a bit about solutions and policy, but I would suggest that Canadian journalism outfits need to explain to the public what makes them trustworthy and important to democracy. How can the industry better able brand itself as rigorous and following codes of conduct versus the disinformation and false information from junk news outlets and even worse actors than that? And I think that the Canadian news industry should be more vocal collectively when there are threats made to its legitimacy and to the work of its reporters. And it should promote digital news literacy as well across the country. And finally, I don't think enough is said about the role of the public service and its communications activities in the fight against fake news. If government continues to constrain bureaucrats so they cannot openly share factual information with the media and the public, then they are doing a great disservice. I have a lot more to say, but that's all for now. Yeah.
Thank you, Jennifer. Our next panelist is Leanne Goodman. She is the politics and business editor at The Conversation Canada, a successful new media startup. I just have to repeat that phrase. A successful new media startup launched in Canada that serves as a platform for news and views from the academic and research community. She's an award-winning journalist who's worked in Washington, D.C., Ottawa, and Toronto, covering everything from the political ascent of Barack Obama during her years as a White House correspondent to the fatal 2014 shooting on Canada's Parliament Hill. Please welcome Leanne.
Thank you. It is nice to say successful media startup, isn't it? One more time. Yeah, it's nice. Preparing for this meeting, we had a little conference call, and Keith had mentioned how Trump, in this era of fake news, has actually been a bit of a boon to news organizations like the New York Times and the Washington Post, CNN, some of the major American networks, which is certainly true. However, I'm not sure that's been the case in some regional news markets, because I still know a lot of people who work in the South and in the Midwest, and their newsrooms, just as what's happening in Canada, are shrinking dramatically. Some communities don't even have any news organizations anymore, nobody covering city council and all that sort of stuff. And that's happening here in a very disturbing scale. And it couldn't really be happening at a worse time when you've got the recent election of people like Doug Ford and Francois Legault who are talking about using the notwithstanding clause to get around the Constitution and all that sort of thing. And the other thing I wanted to add is the fake news phenomenon obviously isn't anything new. I have members of my own family, I've been in journalism for 30 years, who still believe that all the news executives get together before every election and decide who they want to win. And it doesn't matter how many times I say like that, it doesn't happen that way, it's not like that. And my own late mother often believed that things were made up by the media, particularly on any celebrity who she worshipped who found himself or herself in hot water. It was just, well, that was made up. So it's certainly not new, but we're seeing it on a much grander scale now, obviously, because of the advent of social media. The fake allegations of fake news are happening in an era where everyone can go online and say whatever they want to say, and there are no checks and balances. I remember thinking that citizen journalism was going to be this great thing that would be a boon to democracy, and in fact, it's actually been the opposite, because there's nobody. There's no checks and balances in place. There's no fact-checking going on. And you can seek out people who believe the things that you believe, no matter how crazy they are, where you used to just be in your basement shouting at the moon. You can find, 100,000 people out there who believe the things that you believe, and things spread. And so it's been this, and we're seeing this in Canada too, where the strategy of repeating lies until people just start believing them. We're seeing that starting to happen in Ontario. And so there's been this perfect storm of events, an era of extreme political chasms, which Jennifer was talking about, in which it's easy to spread lies via social media, and newsrooms are shrinking. So the media, which used to do the job of fact-checking in Canada anyway, is no longer doing that to the extent that it needs to be doing it. And what few reporters are available are doing things, at least I can tell you in my former career at Canada's national news agency, the Canadian Press, people were getting laid off and fired and not being replaced, and what few resources we did have were being spent chasing really clickbait stories about, you know, some raccoon and a seagull having a brawl in the Walmart parking lot, where they were big. We were actually sort of not even encouraged to have our reporters doing freedom of information requests anymore, because there was a thought that those wouldn't get the kind of buzzy, BuzzFeed type of stories that people wanted to read, which is when I realized that the business was in a fair bit of trouble. So we desperately need a more vibrant media with more reporters doing the investigative work of the type we just saw in the New York Times about the Trump's family's long history of tax evasion. And in Canada, anyway, we have far fewer. And I can tell you, in my career at the Canadian Press, oftentimes I was working as an assignment editor, and it was depressing how often I didn't have anybody to go chase a really good news story that no one else was working on. I would have university comms people pitching this amazing research to me, and we talked a bit about some of this morning in an earlier session, where I couldn't get anybody to do it. There were just no bodies anymore. Never mind uncovering a simmering political scandal. It just wasn't happening. And so the other thing is the days of beat reporters are now over. When Jennifer and Keith and I started in the business, there were beat reporters. There was a science reporter, an environment reporter, a faith reporter. There are no beat reporters in most newsrooms anymore. So it means, you know, if I don't, at CP there is no climate reporter sort of riding herd over the latest climate reports, and that's a huge story that just sometimes just flying under everyone's radar. So this is all to say that's why I think academia may be able to save the world, and that's why I'm such a believer in the Conversation Canada. You guys are all doing incredible research. We heard some story ideas today based on your areas of expertise and your research that are not really getting out there. And I can tell you that from the success the Conversation Canada has had among the general news readership, academics are at least trusted on a higher level than journalists, who I think are at the very bottom right now, and then maybe lawyers. Even my mother, who did not want to believe that Hugh Grant was in the back seat of that taxi with that, like, that was just made up. Even my mother had some respect for an academic's research. And I can give you an example of some amazing stories. In fact, you know, the whole term of fake news I learned from an academic at McMaster University who used to advise the Bill Clinton White House on Russia. He worked and lived in Russia and was a Russia expert. Fake news is a very simple translation of the Russian phrase "pod delny novosti," which means counterfeit or fake news, and they throw it around all the time in Russia. So Trump, here's another little thing that Trump may have borrowed from Putin. It literally means made-up news, and it's a core one in Russian governance, and has a long history in Russia, and suddenly Trump is, you know, weaponized it. And I can just give you another example of some of the amazing research that is getting out there now via organizations like the Conversation Canada and Jennifer's organization. You all remember that terrible thing that Trump said about shithole countries, about the immigrants coming from shithole countries. We went to an academic at the University of Calgary who had done all sorts of deep data and deep research on immigration, new immigrants to Canada. So he immediately could tell us whether it was true that people from shithole countries are a bigger drain on the system than people from the Norways and the Irelands of the world. Well, sure enough, this guy had it all at his fingertips, did an amazing story in which, lo and behold, the people from the shithole countries, in fact, cost the Canadian taxpayers a lot less money than the people from Norway and Ireland who come over here. So we had this headline, you know, Trump is wrong about the shithole countries. He did a whole graph to go in this story that actually had shithole countries at the top and then Norway. And that piece, a couple of things to say about that piece. I could not have gotten that from a reporter. If I was back in the CP newsroom and asked a reporter, let's dispute Trump on this one. Let's look at what Canada has found with these immigrants, and let's do that now. it would have taken a week or two because we reporters don't have that data at their fingertips. And it would have required going to that academic who would have had to pore over the data with the journalist, and then the journalist would have had to sort of translate what the academic was telling them. So one thing, that's a story that we could not have gotten easily from a reporter. And the other thing to say about it is it went crazy. It ended up on all sorts of US websites. I think it ended up getting 150,000 hits because it was putting the lie to the fake news that Trump himself was putting out there. So this is why I want to believe, and I hope that academics can help us get on the right course and to start doing the fact-checking that unfortunately in Canadian newsrooms there's nobody to do anymore. Academics in the mind of the public anyway seem to still have some trust. What they maybe have trouble doing sometimes, no offense, is writing in a way that is a news style that is accessible to the public. So that's what people like Jennifer and I are doing. So I want to hope that that there is a bright spot on the horizon, and I think academia can play a big role in that, because I find this to be a really scary time as a woman, and just when you see the caging of the children and all those, it just seems like every day there's another terrible story, and people believe Trump when he says that his enemies are making that stuff up. So anyway, I have hope that maybe academics can help get us out of this terrible hole. And I'm going to end it there because I'm almost out of time.
Thank you, Leanne. So our next panelist is Elamin Abdelmahmoud, and he is news curation editor with BuzzFeed News and a social media editor for BuzzFeed Canada. He's a panelist and columnist for CBC News. You have to do that when you work for BuzzFeed, right? It's part of the package. He writes a monthly column for Chatelaine magazine. He's taught journalism at Ryerson University, and many of you probably know him from his pretty vibrant Twitter feed.
Don't tweet. Get off Twitter immediately. Hi. I'm really honored to be here. I'm really excited to talk to you guys. And I want to talk to you about two things that I love dearly that are sort of related to fake news. We'll get to that in a minute. So the first one is this podcast called Slow Burn. How many of you have heard of it? It's not bad. Slow Burn is an amazing podcast. It's from Slate. And the premise that the podcast was launched with was this journalist was really deeply interested in the Trump-Russia story in a way where he just couldn't wait to get every single little update. And after sort of going back to listen to the stories about Watergate, he realized that Watergate is something that we think about now as sort of a complete event. Like, this thing happened, and the conclusion of it, Nixon resigned. But like, that's not at all what happened. Watergate took time, took years. Stories breaking week after week after week. And people in the middle of Watergate didn't realize they were in the middle of Watergate. Like, this big thing, they had no idea. And so the central question was, of this podcast, which you should totally listen to, the first season is about this, could we be in the middle of Watergate and not realize it? And then the second thing I want to talk about is the greatest movie of this decade, which is Moneyball. This is very serious. And thank you. And Moneyball is close and dear to my heart, and it's a movie I watch a lot. It's a movie I tweet about a lot. But I also don't like baseball. Never liked baseball. I don't understand it. But if you watch Moneyball and see a movie about baseball, we're watching different movies. Because to me, Moneyball is a movie about a guy, also based on a true story, by the way, about a guy in the middle of a revolution in understanding the game, and everybody else doesn't realize it. And so every single time you rewatch that movie, you understand that Brad Pitt's character, Billy Beane, is like, hey, could stats revolutionize the game of baseball? And everyone is laughing at him and not understanding that, that he can, and he's sort of taking this chance. And the central question of that movie, which is a central question that's interesting to me, that I keep revisiting, is, could I be in the middle of a revolution and not realizing? And I revisit that question a lot. And every time that I revisit it, I come to sort of a different realization about a different revolution that I was already in the middle of, that I didn't realize was happening. The biggest one, for example, being Facebook. Facebook is a massive revolution that we didn't understand the scale of when it began, right? When it began, 2004, you entered your information, sure, you get an account, whatever, and you move on. And then slowly it begins to change our habits. Smartphone is another revolution that we didn't really realize the impact of until we ended up here in a particularly bad place. And so when I say that Facebook was a revolution, what I really mean is it has revolutionized the way that we do nearly everything. One of the biggest ones being how we consume news. So we talked a lot about politicians being at fault for fake news, the media, their role in the spread of it. But you know what? A really big, important factor in all of this and how things got bad is you. I'm not here, I'm sorry, I'm not here to let you off the hook. It's not you personally. But a stark reality is that so many people get their news directly from social media. How many of you, just by show of hands, go like directly to a news organization's website? Are you all lying to me? So, I believe you, because you're a bunch of policy nerds, and that's fine. But the majority of people don't, right? The majority of people get their information pretty passively. The majority of people get their information from scrolling through the feed. Oh, this looks interesting. This doesn't look interesting, and you just keep skipping past it. The big revolution that we didn't realize we were in the middle of, but now we understand the consequences of, is that your cousin Doug and your friend Matt from high school, God bless their hearts, now occupy literally the same visual plane that the New York Times does. This is not a knock on Doug or Matt. I'm sure they're fine. But when they say something that is clearly not true and put it in your feed, it just literally physically looks the same on your screen as when a respected institution that is dedicated, 10 journalists and 4 editors to vet a massive piece, it looks the same. What that does is flatten authority so that everyone feels like they have the same kind of authority. Everyone feels like they can just assert something or contest something because your relationship to the display of news becomes different. Think back to before Facebook, you actually had to go to a different website and say, this is the place where I get my respected information from that has been vetted by a bunch of people. We don't have that anymore. And that's a problem. And it's a problem because most of our news habits and news consumption habits have become really passive. So when you're passive, you're much more likely to just consume things that are just a little bit inaccurate, and then it's just a matter of degrees from there until you're somewhere in very wild sort of conspiracy country. But I think we at BuzzFeed have sort of realized that that is a part of how people consume news. And so when we see a rumor spreading, we have a whole team that's dedicated to debunking hoaxes and debunking misinformation. The reason we do that is precisely because that information travels, right? That information travels, and then the more it travels, the more authority it carries. By the way, that's a huge problem here in Canada that we're sort of looking into ahead of the 2019 election. It's going to be a huge factor here. And so we never really think that we'd get to this place, and then all of a sudden, my colleagues are busy every single day debunking 10, 20 hoaxes that are just getting millions and millions of shares. And so I want you to think about your role in that revolution, because now you're aware of it, right? Now you say you're aware that you are not a victim, but a participant in a news ecosystem that actually has you in the middle. You are necessary in terms of the transference of fake news, not you personally, but people are. That is, after all, the main currency of misinformation and how it spreads. So I'm going to leave it there and put you at fault, and I hope that's okay with you. Thank you.
fantastic. So, questions. We have some students who are going to ask some questions first, followed by the public. Because this is being live streamed, it is important that people only ask questions if you are given the magic microphone, which does not actually amplify your voice, but will ensure that people outside this room can hear you. And I would remind you to ask a question of a single panelist, not of the panel as a whole. And I believe our first student is Hunter Gillis. Yes?
Hi there. My question is for Elamin. First of all, I am a first-year MPA student. So last year on Reddit, a subreddit titled Deepfakes was created. This subreddit contained content which showed the faces of female celebrities realistically imposed onto the bodies of porn actresses. This is done with an AI toolkit by the users who submitted this content to the subreddit. To someone who didn't know the difference, they may have believed this was in fact a real person in the video. The ability to create content such as this could lead to political candidates and other figures having videos and audio clips doctored to make it appear to be them engaging in unsavory activities. Potentially as well, you could have the flip side. Someone who did engage in unethical behavior could argue with reasonable doubt that it is not them in the clip. How could you see this impacting the very concept of truth and fact? Could you argue that we'll soon be entering an era of post-truth, where you can no longer trust what your eyes and ears are telling you to be true? Similar to what you said in your talk about revolutions that we're in. Are we in a period now, maybe, the revolution where post-truth is occurring now?
I'm going to take the moderator's prerogative. Could the people in the back of the room hear that question? Not at all. Okay, so the question is, in an era when technologically you can make it appear as if anyone is doing anything, often fairly unsavory things, what sort of impact would that have on politics, and are we actually entering a post-truth world? Is that a fair summary? Okay, that would be the question. And it was for Elamin.
Yeah, it's too late. Welcome. And I, it's a good laugh, thank you. But I wasn't saying that to be funny. I think we're already there. So we did this video last year to sort of show the how manipulable the deep fakes are of Obama saying things that he would never say, just based on having hundreds and hundreds of hours of past speeches. And so we are getting to a stage where it's going to become very difficult to tell if a video is real or not. I think we had the technology down for determining whether images are real or not. Not everyone has that technology. Not everyone is well versed in that technology, but we're getting there. But in terms of videos, it sort of opens up a whole new can of worms. And what's going to be interesting to me about it is how those politicians respond to those deepfakes. Because someone's going to produce a video evidence of you doing something that you didn't do and you know you didn't do. And video, this is all of our faults, by the way. Video seems to carry this different kind of authority. That is, that we have a close belief that video can't be manipulated. And so challenging that belief, I think we're in for a shitstorm, I'm sorry.
Answer the first question, shitstorm here.
Yes.
Second question, Justin Satosik, who's got the microphone there, and I will repeat your question.
So my question is for Elamin as well. Recent discussions have been about Facebook and Google sort of acting like a regulatory agency or doing a check service for fake news. With the prevalence of information that's out there on the web, is the onus to determine that something is fake or real on these tech companies such as Google and Facebook, or do you believe it's on the readers themselves?
So the question is, who carries the responsibility for determining what's bogus on social media? Is it the technology companies, or is it the audience and the readers themselves? And it was for Elamin.
It's certainly a shared responsibility between the two, but my God, those platforms could be doing so much more. And every day we get stories of, so for example, my colleague Craig Silverman, who you mentioned earlier, broke this story about how there are people that dedicate their time to just flagging fake accounts on Facebook, to Facebook, and a lot of the times Facebook is A, not doing that work, but B, not even taking them seriously. And they keep being frustrated by that. And so I think these organizations are beginning to understand just like how bad things are. I think Twitter's gotten a little bit better at it. They've learned some techniques for how to suppress, for example, hoaxes once they notice that a hoax has been spreading. And then Facebook had like a really big page purge, I think, on Friday. But all of these are reactive. Like they're yet to develop a sort of proactive model for suppressing fake news, and so that is on them because everyone has pointed out to them that they could very easily do that. Facebook has time and time again been asked to open up their algorithms so that people can, contribute to solving the problem of how these news stories spread, and they're not really willing to do that.
Okay. Our third question is from Benji Spugget.
Hi, I'm a Master's of Resource and Environmental Management student, and my question is for Keith. President Trump has been effective in relying on fake news and alternative facts to push his own agenda, with a notable example being his attack on climate change and ultimate withdrawal from the Paris Climate Agreement as a way to promote industry development in the United States. So my question is, what role do journalists play in keeping the public informed on issues that directly counter government decisions?
So the question is, what role do journalists play in keeping the public informed on issues that are directly contrary to government positions? And then the question was for Keith.
Yeah, I think the only thing that's really changed with Trump in that regard, because our responsibility has always been to get the facts and to present them in a way that's understandable and to some extent to show our work. What Trump has done is corrupt the media in a certain sense by making us now have to point out not just that he's in error, but that he's deliberately in error. I think there's a word for that, right? It's called lying. and the media in the United States have had this maybe sterile, useless debate about whether they should use the word or not. That's not really where the action is, but when I say that this is the corrupting effect of Trump on the media, that's what I mean, that we get preoccupied with these kinds of things, and we have to continually find ways to tell people this is not normal. So it's not just a question of, well, Trump said this, if this is the truth. There's a whole context for that that's important to understanding what's happening in America now that we have to tell alongside just reporting what the truth is.
Okay. Do we have a question from Peter Velasco?
Hello, I am in the master's program in the Department of Political Science. My question is for Leanne. So all the panelists have basically said that fake news is a thing. It's a real thing, and it's existed long before Trump. But also I've heard every panelist, and just in general, everyone just accepts the fact that Trump has hijacked that term and turned it on its head. So my question is, do you believe that it's possible to reclaim the true definition? Because that true definition is more important now than ever. And if so, who can do that? Is it the media? Is it academia? And how?
So the question's for Leanne, I believe. And it is it possible to reclaim the original meaning of fake news, meaning that information that is actually false? And if so, who can do that?
Well, I think Keith touched on it a bit. We've got to start actually honestly reporting and saying outright when what is spoken by a politician is a lie. And I think there's been a hesitancy to do that. I even know in Canadian newsrooms, it's like, well, that's you're really crossing a line if you come right out and call a politician a liar. And I think Trump has changed that. I think that is something that we're now starting to see and do more often. And I can't, firstly, may I apologize to you for insulting BuzzFeed, because I didn't really, it's been weighing on me since I started speaking. But anyway, it's always been something that journalists should be doing, but I can tell you that what's happened, I think, as a reporter, is that you were always afraid that you were going to be accused of having a left-wing bias. And so I think reporters went too far the other way to make sure that nobody would ever accuse them of having a left-wing bias. And I don't think that left-wing bias is about partisanship. It's about, as journalists, you get out and you are talking to real people and you are seeing how people live, and you are in homeless shelters, and you develop possibly a bit more compassion about what people are enduring than you might if you never went out and talked to those people, if you didn't ever engage with people. So I do believe that journalists have been too shy about defending themselves. It's not that we have a left-wing bias, it's that we see more and talk to more people than you do. And I do think that has contributed to some of the problems, that we are afraid to say when a politician is lying because you get a mob coming after you. Now on social media all the time, you will get a mob. You dealt with this covering Harper. These really nasty mob coming after you if you ever sort of reported truthfully that this was bullshit. Anyway.
I just would add something, is that I think that the term fake news is basically, we cannot reclaim it. And I think Europe has, there is a new kind of policy in Europe to refer to disinformation, so that we're not confused anymore, because I think we've gone past the point where we can reclaim fake news as referring to actually false stories, and where we need to appropriate other language to say that this is disinformation,
right,
or disorientation, or the like, unfortunately. Because now fake news, I'll just give you a small example from Twitter over the weekend, but I posted very innocuously an article about excise taxes and cannabis, and whether people were going to be substituting alcohol for cannabis, and that would have an impact on how you tax all the rest of this tobacco and alcohol and so on. And someone tweeted at me saying, "Fake news," like in capital letters. And I said, you know, it's a story about excise taxes. And and then this person continued to challenge me, and I said, well, did you click on the studies and read the article, which the person had not at all. There are studies that show product substitution in other jurisdictions. So you see what I mean? You can't win against the fake news thing, because people just fling it out. I don't like that. Fake news, and that's just the way the world is now.
Thanks, Jennifer. Brianna Wolf, you have a question for us, yes?
My question is for Jennifer. All right. Journalism provides an effective tool for educating the public about fake news. However, the 2016 U.S. elections legacy and President Donald Trump's criticism of the press in particular is still relatively fresh in our minds. So I was wondering if you could expand upon the ways that journalism is changing to mitigate the damage that was created by the U.S. election and the spread of fake news.
So how is journalism changing to mitigate the damage, I think, to the credibility of journalism in the 2016 election? And that was for Jennifer, yes? Mm-hmm. Okay.
Well, I actually think that if I can talk about Canada, but I don't actually think that media outlets have done enough. We haven't exactly experienced what they're experiencing in the United States. There's been some collective action there amongst media organizations and who are standing up to what's happening. But I think in Canada, media organizations have been pretty reluctant to get together and say, you know, we are legitimate news organizations. You know, this is why you should read us and why we're different from that crap on the bottom of every story that is usually some kind of fake article that's circulated by a junk news site. And this is, I think, where the policy thinking has to go now, even at the federal and provincial levels, is in the area of digital and news literacy. So how do you teach people how to discern between a good news site and a bad news site? And this goes to what Elamin was talking about as well. But as news organizations, I think you're at the point where you have to tell people that you're an institution with a code of conduct, where journalists are called on the carpet if they get something wrong. This is all the rigor that you attach to articles. We no longer, as media organizations, can just sit back and expect people to respect us. I think that there needs to be almost like a good housekeeping seal of approval to identify, you know, which are the junk sites and which are the good sites. So.
And the panelists want to jump in on this one.
Yeah, I just thought it was an interesting moment also, like, to remind people that New York Times and the Washington Post took this opportunity to come up with some mottos, right? Like, they were like, we're going to do some branding around this because it's such an intense, polarized time that people are really looking for truth. Washington Post went with the dramatic, which is democracy dies in darkness, which Right. I mean, it's a little Shakespearean and intense, but it's not untrue. And so I find that particular move on those on newsrooms, interesting. I also like what they're doing in terms of making the journalism process a bit more transparent. They're doing more Q&As. Editors are a bit more available to chat with people about how stories kind of came together. All of that is not nearly enough because the trust is so damaged. But they're trying.
So just a couple of points. Speaking of trust, there is something called the Trust Project, which is a work in progress right now. CBC has just joined it. I don't know if it's international. I wouldn't say that it's worldwide. But among the things that it will do, we'll try to educate the public for what indicators, trust indicators, are available at what media. For instance, CBC has for a long time had an ombudsman. Other big newspapers have public editors. There are other things that can be done that media organizations are experimenting with or embracing. And I think over time, and I hope a short period of time, these are the standards that everybody will look to when they want to know in a confused world whom they can trust. And you won't see that at Breitbart.
Excellent. So now we've got a nice meaty chunk of time for questions from the room. So Tari is going to, you're going to put up your hands, I'm going to point to someone, and then Tari's going to bring you the microphone. You're going to ask your question, and then he's going to take it away from you so that while the question is being answered, and I will repeat the question to everyone. And this is so that we don't, one, so that we don't get really long follow-ups, but two, so that we don't have a lot of downtime for the microphone to travel to the next person. You good? We didn't discuss this in advance. You're good with that, Tari, right? Absolutely. Okay, so let's start right here. Yes, right behind you.
Hi. My question is for Leanne. I was wondering, in an era of shrinking newsrooms, lack of resources for journalists, and the competition with other news sources, there's a incentive or a pressure to report on more clickbait-style sensationalist stories. Excuse me. Do you have any ideas of how reporters can balance kind of effective journalism on more kind of meaty content issues with being able to draw in readers with those kinds of stories that readers seem to seek out?
So the question is, in an era of diminished newsroom resources, how do reporters balance the pressure to go after clickbait in favor of more interesting and important stories? And the question was for Leanne.
It's hard, and I really feel for reporters in shrinking newsrooms right now because they don't like doing those sorts of buzzy stories, that nobody wants to be out chasing some dumb story or making calls on a story. And this is a real example. What's the deal with gerbils and hamsters? I had to assign somebody that story on the day after Rob Ford died. So it is, I don't envy reporters, and it's not easy. You have to start really doing your own. You can't go into a newsroom anymore as a reporter without like 10 or 12 story ideas that you have to sell to your editor that will hopefully do both. But it's not easy because you get pulled and pressed to do dumb stories, or you get pressured to, or you don't have anybody to do stories. There's just one of you and you're expected to do 5 or 6 stories in a day. So the trick is you just have to go into work every day. If any of you are pondering a career in the newsroom, you have to go into work every day with a dozen story ideas, and you have to mine all sorts of ride herd over all sorts of different publications and universities, web pages where you can see the interesting research that they're doing to try to find something that no one else is doing. But it's not easy.
Elamin wanted to jump in quickly.
Yeah, I just wanted to add to that I used to work at a convenience store. People used to come and buy newspapers from me, and they would literally take out the sports section and the lifestyle section and throw out the rest of the paper. So I just want to dispel the myth that people have always been yearning for like these like meaty stories.
That's true.
People don't care. I mean, like, not to say that too flippantly, but those meaty stories are somewhat in demand in terms of value for our democracy, but in terms of audiences, let's not overestimate the number of audiences who are like, I want a deep dive on this policy issue and I want 3,000 words, I want it today.
And I'm willing to pay for it.
Yeah, exactly,
Yeah.
100%.
Journalism.
But quirky is always
economics.
good.
How about Matt Strickland, the man with the beard?
So this is kind of a follow-up question to that, and I'm not 100% sure which one of you is the best one to answer that, so field day. The journalists I'm talking to for a feature I'm writing right now are saying that in-depth quality reporting is happening, but it's behind paywalls and no one's reading it. And if no one's reading it, and that's the issue, is that a problem that journalists can solve, or should?
So the question is, if there's still a lot of in-depth reporting happening, but it's behind a paywall, can journalists solve that problem in terms of having more people read it? Matt broke the rules by not addressing that to someone, and I think Keith's going to answer that one.
Maybe not the best, maybe not the best person, but maybe not the best person because my media environment is not Canada. And as somebody mentioned, you know, I see a lot of great journalism happening in the United States because of the moment that we are in. And maybe some of it is behind paywalls, but I'm astonished, but I can't get through in a day what I would like to get through, either reading or listening to podcasts. The amount of information and the quality of it is something I think that is going to be looked back upon as a kind of golden age. And it's rising up in the face of this ugly challenge to the legitimacy of a free press. Without making a whole big speech about it, I think that the issue is different in Canada. I think that there are not a lot of good examples of business models that are working in the new world of media, and people are still struggling with that. And I think that there is a price to pay for that as time goes by and they don't solve it. My own view is that there is a crisis in Canadian media that doesn't exist in the United States, but I don't think crisis is too strong a word.
Thank you. Somebody on this side. T-shirt, glasses. Yes.
My question is for Keith as well, as kind of a follow-up on that. With the growing complexity of international relations and, you know, borders being created, technologies, just new information being created, more things to know, do you think that the growth in the number of things to know, like you're talking about how difficult it is to get it all in during the day, which I can completely sympathize with, do you think that that's contributing to the issue where people have to pare down what they can consume, and in that way they end up creating these avenues where they only read what they want to consume? Is it possible that the wealth of even good information creates a challenge for people?
So the question is, does the incredible volume of information right now actually lead us to narrower channels because we're having to select, and it was for Keith?
I think that people's interests are well satisfied by the depth with which they can pursue a narrow range of things. And for many people that is satisfying. That's enough, because, you know, some personalities like to know an awful lot about a few things, and other personalities are different. There's a part of your question that makes me think how my life has changed with Trump. First of all, it requires that I learn a lot more than I've ever had to learn about things I didn't think were going to be questioned, right? And these are not just in policy things, but how does the FBI actually work when it's going to investigate a president, right? There's not a simple answer to that, and the scholarship on it is deep. But that's now part of my job to know that. And there are things about how NATO works, how international relations work. It's exhausting, but it's also, I mean, it's incredibly stimulating. I don't know that I can answer that question. I think it's a really big question, but you know, people have always approached problems in different ways that suit them. And I think this world, without going so far as you get into a heavily curated news flow towards yourself called the Daily Me, you can still, I think, indulge a little bit more to a productive extent of your Daily Me than you did before.
Thank you.
I don't know if that's an answer. It's a good question, but I don't know that there is an answer.
Okay. How about here? Glasses. Yes. Sorry.
This is for Leanne about use of academia. So academia experiences its own parallels of fake news with conflicts like bias framing and funding stakeholders. As we move forward using academic work, how do you propose to battle those reports or false evidence being perpetuated. And as there is very simply bad research being used alongside the claim of academic free speech, do you think that there will be a shift in trust of academia as it becomes polarized and politicalized as there has been with journalism?
Okay, so for those of you over there, the question is, do you think that there will be a declining trust in academia as it becomes increasingly polarized and politicized, as trust has eroded, similar to the way trust has eroded in journalism? Is that accurate?
And also that there's, just with the bias framing and funding stakeholders in academia, there is a conflict of research that is accurate and not.
Okay. And the question was for Leanne, correct?
Well, yes, and I really can only speak to how the conversation handles those issues, and every academic who writes for us has to disclose if they've taken, whoever they've taken any funding from. It's part of your responsibility when you sign up as an author, and we have actually later found out that authors didn't disclose and have had to go back to them and either ask them to update the disclosure or taken their stories down. So it's something you have to keep an eye on and ride herd over. It's hard, I can tell you on the Jordan Peterson thing, which is where a lot of debate about this has happened because he has stated some things that aren't necessarily in his area of expertise. I can tell you that we must have gotten 50,000 pitches from academics wanting to weigh in on Jordan Peterson. And he's been a problem for U of T, I can tell you that, in terms of how they handle it. Because he has said some things that aren't based in science or in fact at all. So certainly, I don't mean to suggest that academics and academia is a perfect world. There's obviously, when there's human beings involved, there's bias. And I've always maintained that journalists are not unbiased. Everybody has their biases. You got to check them at the door when you go to write your piece, and I think that's the same sort of thing that we're insisting upon from academics at the conversation. Sometimes maybe we'll fall down. I hope we don't, but it's something we keep an eye on.
Questions? Oh, in the very back row, in the blue.
Just several people have talked about how, I guess this is for Leanne, how the local media, especially and media organizations in general, are struggling. Do you see a role for government in addressing this? There have been some prescriptions. I don't think they've had a lot of attention, but do you see any indication that government is concerned about the role of media organizations, and do you see any sense they're going to do anything?
I believe that governments should be funding our local media organizations. Absolutely. It's happening in Europe. It's happening in Scandinavian countries. Those news organizations are vital to the health of local communities. If you don't have any information about your city council, that is a real place where government needs to step up. And I'm sure Jennifer knows a bit about this as well.
Well, there is a fund that's being developed, a local media fund within the government, but I think there's some low-hanging fruit that they haven't yet picked. One of them is to allow media organizations to have charitable status. La Presse, for example, is moving towards that model, and there's a very good book by Robert Entman from the 1970s, which the name eludes me right now, but it's about the conflict between the role of the media in educating and informing the public and the commercial or capitalist format of the media, which kind of run against each other. And so one way of, I think, restoring faith in journalism as an institution, not for every organization, but for some, is to look at different models which don't rely on advertisers and big corporate sponsors and so on. There are models that are possible. There's philanthropic models. You can have funding campaigns for certain coverage of articles. There's interesting models going on in the United States around that. So I think we need to broaden the landscape on that. And it's a policy issue that's been largely ignored by governments for decades. And now we're at the cliff where we could be losing many of our major newspapers in Canada to bad financial times. So they need to talk about this right away. Yeah.
Okay. How about Colin on the back row there? There were also a couple of reports commissioned by the federal government on this topic, if you want to look them up.
My question is for Jennifer. I was wondering what you thought of the Ontario government's creation of Ontario News Now, which is essentially a PR or propaganda instrument masquerading in the form of a legitimate journalism like television channel. I was wondering what you thought of that and how that model could affect Canadian politics going forward.
So what does Jennifer think of the Ontario News Now government communications channel, which tries to look like an actual journalism outlet?
Well, it's a great example of what I was talking about before, of everything being a continuum. And federally, the Conservative government in Ottawa had its own news channel on YouTube, which is called 24/7.
Yeah.
And the problem with that, which I think most people didn't focus in on, which was what your tax dollars were paying for that. So we're paying for basically a political message to be broadcast to the public. That was always my main problem with it. If you actually watch those shows, they're really crap. I mean, I think like the most. It's true. I mean, the average person will watch that and understand that there's absolutely no context given to anything. It's just a promotional video. But I think that the real problem with it is the blurring of between partisan and political, and I really think that we should be religious about this. The public services and premiers' offices and so on. And this also relates to social media. I mean, let's not say that the current federal government is not doing this through Twitter and everything else. It's Facebook feeds and so on. But if they want to do that, they should pay for it with their political party coffers and not with the provincial or federal coffers.
Got time for at least one more. How about there?
Keith, this is a question for you. We started talking about this before we came in, and it's got nothing and everything to do with the media and the free press, and it's got to do with democracy dies in darkness. So there's increasing discussion in the U.S. about fascism and the U.S., not amongst the right-wing press, but the New York Times has started to raise the issue of fascism in the U.S. So because the free press and democracy are so interrelated and support each other so tightly, I would argue, and I think you would probably agree with me, what do you think in the bigger picture is, and democracy and the free press are very unusual things to happen in human history. Both those things are kind of weird and rare. So what do you think in the bigger picture from your knowledge of the US and the way it's been going, do you think democracy and the free press are going to win in the United States? Thinking of the other things that are at play here, gerrymandering, the racial tensions, the NRA, et cetera, that you know more about than I do.
Question for Keith, are democracy and free press going to win in the US?
Well, I mean, my short answer would be if the free press wins, then democracy will win. I think the two are that closely tied. But I don't think that you're miscasting or underestimating the moment. There are serious problems in the United States with regard to its democracy and its representational values that pre-exist Trump, right? That, we've sort of slipped into this time, in the U.S., we sort of slipped into this time without noticing that I think there have been 5 presidents elected who won the Electoral College without winning the popular vote. 2 of them have been since 2000, right? That's a high degree. The propensity for that to happen again, I think, is growing, and it will happen only on the right. It will not happen on the left. You're seeing the things that you mentioned, gerrymandering. Gerrymandering is a very complicated issue. We should not be reflexively against having politics determine boundaries and so on, electoral boundaries. But the idea that it should be done for partisan purposes so that you can, in South Carolina, for example, have a significant majority of people vote for Democrats and have a significant majority of seats in the legislature controlled by Republicans is going to lead to a problem, guaranteed. It cannot go on. There has been a lot of discussion about what would happen if Trump won in 2020 and again did not win the popular vote. I mean, that, I think, would produce some kind of a crisis. We had some discussion about the Electoral College after the 2016 election, but I think that happening 3 times in the space of 2 decades would be a shocking moment for a lot of Americans, and I can see that happening, frankly. I don't think it's an unlikely event at all. There are lots of things being tested, but the real stress test is the Trump administration, which is actively telling people not to trust their law enforcement agencies, not to trust their Department of Agriculture, not to trust any of the government bureaucracies that are necessary for people to have a functioning government, right? What will he tell us not to trust next? Does it depend on what Robert Mueller reports? I mean, it's a crazy, crazy time, and it is not something that we should be experimenting with lightly. But apparently, you know, that's what we have decided, that's what Americans have decided to do with their government for the time being. The November elections 3 weeks from today, I think, are probably crucially important because I want to be careful what I say here for obvious reasons. But I think it's demonstrably true that the Republicans who control Congress have had no interest in holding this president to account. The Constitution of the United States does not work if the Congress doesn't exercise its check on the presidency. And so it almost cries out for accountability, does it not? And that cries out for a particular electoral result, does it not? And if we see that, then I think the next 2 years before the 2020 election will give us a much better sense of where we are and a much better way to answer your question.
I'm interested in this because, so was it 2 weeks ago that the New York Times published that massive 15,000-word story about Trump's finances, about how his father, through various sort of tax fraudulent schemes, gave his son millions and millions of dollars. And one of the things that came out about that story, because it's such a big, massive thing to publish, was that originally they had a lot of that information ready to go a year ago or around the election time. And I think it was the executive editor who said, we should go now. We have to publish now, while this has sort of the attention of the people. And the journalist pushed back and said, no, it's not ready yet. There's more to the story to be nailed down. Well, it landed, and it took up the news cycle for about 7 seconds, and then now it's gone. And so when we say the Free Press, the Free Press is doing probably the best work it's ever done in its history. And the problem is us. The problem is us because we're not responding to that. And probably the most shocking thing about all of this is how easy it was for someone like Trump to hijack those institutions by just giving different messages. And no matter how organizations say, but that's not true, it's as though there's a T-Rex in the room, and everyone just wants to look at the T-Rex. And no matter what organizations say, well, like, hey, well, that's a T-Rex, and people are like, no, let us look. And so I admire your optimism, but
that was optimism?
I mean, like, not to give a more bleak version of this, but I think we're the problem. And so
I might disagree with that a bit because there's so many huge stories every day that even as we know as news consumers, it's hard to stay on one story. Like that story broke in the middle of the Kavanaugh hearings, and you can't not cover the Kavanaugh hearings. Like, you know what I mean? I hesitate to put too much blame on the news consumer when we're in an era where every day there's 10 or 15 stories that would have sunk an ordinary president. Like if Obama had done 1/1000th of the things that Trump had done, the Democrats, even in Congress, might have moved towards impeachment. The problem is, in the Watergate era, you had some Republican congressional representatives with some integrity who moved to impeach their president. That's not happening with this bunch of Republicans because they want to load up the Supreme Court to get all the anti-abortionists on. It's a very complicated, hellish hellscape there right now, and I feel sorry.
I think the answer was, we're not sure.
I don't think it's fair to blame the news consumer in this crazy era of a million stories a week that are unbelievable. It's hard to keep track.
It is time to wrap up.
Sorry.
You said you had...
I just want to make one little point about the New York Times piece, because I've heard this criticism since the thing was published, that they should have put it out in a serialized version and so on. But I think if you read the story, then you know that there were difficulties in how they were going to do it. It's very dry, and you've got to be committed to reading it. I think the point of the story was the size of it, that if people knew only one thing, which was there's a 15,000-word piece in the New York Times that exposes his tax avoidance schemes and fraudulent business practices, I think that's enough.
I'll just say one last thing, which is I think people don't seem to care, and then they do.
Right.
Yeah, there's that.
And one example is the incredible work that the Globe and Mail did on unfounded cases of sexual assault. And we know this. We know that women aren't listened to, but it took that massive project by Robin Doolittle and the Globe to affect change across the country. And we see that in federal politics all the time. You think, like, God, isn't anyone listening? Like, don't they care? And then all of a sudden they do. And so who knows what will happen.
So I'm so pleased I was right and learned so much. Thank you so much, panelists, for joining us. And thank you also to those of you who showed up in the room and those of you who are listening to the live stream. Again, this was put on by the MacEachen Institute and also Policy Options. So thanks, everyone. And we are done.
Kelly. I think you did a really great job.